You're listening to the Sea Change podcast, covering the trends and issues in Southeast Asia.
Hello all, and welcome to the first episode of Sea Change podcast. My name is Nick Basson, and I'm delighted to be joined by Jon Berry. Jon is an Associate Director at KPMG's Australia Geopolitical Hub. To kick things off today, Jon, it would be fantastic for our listeners to understand a little bit more about yourself and some of your experience in the region.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me, Nick. So I wouldn't call myself a Southeast Asian specialist, but having worked as a trade policy consultant and advisor for Australia's agricultural interests and minerals interests and so on, the ASEAN Southeast Asian region is always an important part of the world for our exporters and also for our outward FDI and sourcing for inward FDI too. So the projects and clients that I guess I've worked with that have been most relevant to your interests are some very big Malaysian conglomerates, diversified conglomerates who are in media and resources and so on. I've consulted directly to those companies and also sort of advised intergovernmental bodies like the APEC Secretariat and the ASEAN Secretariat on development projects, case studies, this kind of thing. So, ASEAN, I think sometimes we make the mistake of thinking of ASEAN as sort of a unified whole, whereas it's actually a collection of member states with very different and varying outlooks and stages of development and interests and so on. Yes, I guess my journey has, being based in Australia, it's always really good to remember the importance of our neighbours in our economic and also sort of security well-being.
Yeah, thanks there, Jon. Seems like you have a very diverse experience. The first question we'll be looking at today is around global supply chains. So there at the Geopolitical Hub, I understand that you've done a number of studies on this area. So in terms of the lack of resilience of global supply chains, it's been very evident during COVID-19, things such as the Ukrainian conflict and also US-China trade war. To what extent do you think there is now a premium to be paid to diversify supply chains away from single sourcing? So no longer just producing in China, but looking at the Southeast Asian market as an alternative?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think the supply chain thing you can look at in a few different ways. The way the issue is often presented in the media is as you got to there, that this question of diversification, not having all your eggs in one basket. Whether you're talking about where you're sourcing important things from or where you're selling to, either way, it's a general good rule of economics and business to diversify your risk. So that's part of it. And I think that was driven home to a lot of Australian industries, over the last few years with the kind of trade barriers and trade bans that they faced in their very big markets. So that's part of it. But then I think if you take a step back, and this isn't just I guess I'm not just talking about Southeast Asia here, but if you take a step back and look at the global trade environment, we're moving from this stage of arguably a genuine global trading system where, countries and companies were more or less free to procure what they wanted from the best source at the best price, and every part of the world got to specialize in what it did best and so on. And then over at least the last 5 years, maybe even earlier, that sort of one big happy family is fracturing into you could call them rival trading spheres, or there's this sort of more overt willingness for countries to say, we're going to increase our trade with like-minded partners and we're going to reduce our reliance either in terms of export earnings or in terms of what we need to import. We're going to reduce our reliance on those parts of the world that don't see eye to eye with us politically. So that's a change. So I think when we think about supply chains, this diversification idea is sometimes less about diversifying and more about reconcentrating along political or ideological lines. And that, if I, in a very long-winded way, brings me back around to Southeast Asia, and particularly from an Australian point of view, that I think both Australian government interests and commercial interests are looking again at Southeast Asia as a potential engine for growth for our export markets and also source of important imports that we want to buy, tech goods especially, manufactured goods. And this premium for diversification that you mentioned there, I see that more as a geopolitical premium that people are more and more willing to pay. So part of that is pragmatic. A company might feel like if they rely on only country A for all of their imports of something that they really, really need, then they're willing to pay a little more to have some alternative sources in case country A goes, either the commercial conditions get worse in country A, or there's a political decision not to export something critical. And we're seeing those sort of geopolitically driven export decisions being made all over the world. Like some really recent interesting examples are the way that the United States is limiting technology exports. And trying to strategically, thinking about it, I guess it's geostrategic interests when telling its companies how they can do business. So that's new. I mean, it's not entirely new, but it certainly feels like a new mood or an intensification. So the premiums to be paid are as much around, I would argue, geopolitical like-mindedness as they are around commercial diversification. And so again, coming back around to Southeast Asia, I think there are growing opportunities for Western markets like Australia, but also the very big Western markets in North America and Europe, really turning their attention to some ASEAN members as a sort of preferred source of many important goods that may have previously come from China. So yeah, I guess just a slightly different angle on the kind of forces that you're talking about there, Nick.
Yeah, there's definitely a huge geopolitical factor in businesses moving away from China. Kind of another point here is we see rising labour costs in China. Do you think this is a factor in businesses moving away in order to search for that lower cost of production, or is it mainly a geopolitical play?
I think there's a few forces that are all kind of working in concert. Like if we look at one effect that you can observe that people are talking about a lot in recent months and years, which is that a certain amount of tech manufacturing has been sort of, relocated from China to some places in Southeast Asia. Vietnam has been a major beneficiary of this trend. So I don't think you can say it's all one thing. Like definitely at the same time as I guess China is, the labour cost advantage that China has enjoyed for a long time over certainly the developed world, that has narrowed. I mean, standard of living, economic growth, and wages in China have all trended upwards over the last 20 years. Which is generally good news for people in China, but certainly changes that comparative advantage picture in labour-intensive industries. So that's part of it. Part of it is this, geopolitical de-risking that we were talking about just before. But then linked to that, you can't overlook trade policy actions like the former President Trump's tariffs, additional tariffs on China, on pretty much all goods from China, which are still in place. Those 25% and so on tariffs are still in place, and so that just changes the calculus for a big company who services the US market especially. So if that plays into your decision if you're deciding where to locate or relocate your manufacturing base. If another country allows you to avoid that American tariff, then that may well be an important contributor to that sort of decision too. So it's not just one thing, but maybe with the exception of the wages in China being rising, because that's related to a whole lot of things. But other things often have a geopolitical undercurrent, like obviously the tariffs that I'm talking about that are still in place in the US. So yes, and yes. I think there are many reasons for big companies to make those decisions, which, by the way, are not small decisions to make. Moving manufacturing, it can't be done by flipping a switch. But the research that I've seen suggests that labour-intensive manufacturing industries that are focused on a Western market, more of them are moving out of China and into places including Southeast Asia, also Mexico, also India. There are other beneficiaries too, that are going in the opposite direction. Yeah.
Yeah, by the sounds of it there, John, these supply chain networks and dynamics that are happening at the moment are extremely complex, and they don't just focus on the Southeast Asian market, but they're really global in their approach and the perspective you have to take to analyse them. They are a very fascinating space, but due to time constraints today, we'll kind of shift the conversation into more the decarbonisation space. So decarbonisation is an extremely relevant topic at the moment. What do you think this push for decarbonisation will have? What kind of effect will it have on Southeast Asia? And additionally, how can Australian businesses help Southeast Asia transition effectively?
You can sort of look at it, I guess, shorter or longer run, and from a higher level or a closer up view. But a few things that I think are really interesting about this kind of decarbonisation or energy transition that the world is going through, and it seems like that will continue for some time, that I guess the world power map is influenced by hydrocarbons. Who has them, who produces them, and who buys them. So a lot of the kind of big power relationships in the world, energy is at least an element to them. And as we're seeing, of course, in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and everything that's flowing out of that, and how important the sort of Russia's power as a gas and oil exporter is in all of that. So you can argue that the current geopolitical power map of the whole world, energy is a factor, not the only factor, but it's a pretty big driver of geopolitical strength. So as the world transitions to a greater share of renewable energy, driven by the need to decarbonize, we're going to see all of these really interesting effects where maybe the future wars won't be fought for access to oil and gas, or, big oil and gas producers won't be able to sort of hold consumers to ransom in quite the same way that they have been able to in past decades. We might see other things start to become critical for geostrategic power, and the things that I guess are looming as the theatres of competition and confrontation of the future are critical minerals and research and development. So as we all try to, and I guess I'm not talking about Southeast Asia here in focus, it's more the whole world, as the countries of the world realise that their ongoing economic success, and therefore ability to function as a state, is going to depend on their ability to maintain and have renewable energy sources. The need for a whole range of critical minerals, rare earth minerals, and at the moment it's lithium, but who knows what the battery technologies of the future will be, molybdenum, cobalt. There are all these sort of critical minerals, some of which are not, some of which are really concentrated in terms of where they come from and where reserves are in the world. Those trade in those goods might start to be as strategic as trade in hydrocarbons is today. So that's one thing that's happening. But then at the same time, if we overlay that with this kind of fracturing of the global trading system along political lines that we were talking about earlier, you start to see intellectual property and research and development as just as important. A country like Australia, has in theory great resources for renewable energy. We've got sun and wind and tides and a lot of the critical minerals that are needed for those industries. But without access to the R&D, that they can't fully be capitalised on. And so I guess if you looked at Southeast Asia, you could say the same thing. There are some countries in Southeast Asia have good preconditions for renewable energy, some less so. Like Indonesia, your archipelago sort of countries, perhaps less so, although who knows what the next generation of renewable energy sources are going to be. Certainly a lot of geothermal energy in Indonesia, unfortunately, some years. But the countries are going to need access to technology, research and development, therefore intellectual property, as well as access to sort of the raw materials, the critical minerals that'll go, and also less critical minerals, things like steel and copper and, all of those metals that are necessary for big renewables projects. And that's going to lead that's going to play out at the same time, I believe, as this kind of closing off of areas of the global market. And I alluded before to US restrictions on technology exports. I think that's an early example of something we're going to see much more of from all parts of the world as governments seek to kind of limit their rivals or geostrategic adversaries from getting access to sort of the tech and the inputs that will be needed for the energy and for the industries of the future. So that puts ASEAN in a pretty interesting place. In some ways, a similar place to Australia, where most ASEAN nations have close economic links with both the West and East Asia. The sort of the US field of play and the Chinese field of play. And just like Australia, it's going to become increasingly challenging to balance the preferences and kind of walk the tightrope between those two superpowers. I think that it could be that in ASEAN you might start to see a little bit more polarization between those that kind of fall in along US lines and those that locate themselves politically closer to China. That's going to be a tension within the ASEAN organization, I think, as we go forward. And energy is one of the areas where that's going to become acute, perhaps sooner than we think.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see the materialization of energy as a geopolitical tool. We see Russia kind of deploying energy as a tool in Europe. I wonder just how long and what incident might spark a similar event in Southeast Asia. Kind of building on this idea of Australian companies becoming more involved in Southeast Asia, whether it be through the energy transition space or through other industries. I think we'll see this further integration with Southeast Asia. Through kind of your work with the region, with private companies, Have you come across any strategies which are often employed by Australian businesses to do risk investments in Southeast Asia?
Sure. Look, a lot of this has been said before, but I think that's probably because it's true. A challenge for Australian firms, especially smaller and medium-sized ones, is that making a meaningful foray into Southeast Asia, and taking Indonesia as an example, it's a long-term proposition, and it really requires time on the ground. It requires investment in the right relationships, and it's not just sort of a plug and play proposition. And so the quality and trust with partners in market is crucial. And I guess I see alongside that one of the challenges that Australian operators face for a lot of them is sort of a lack of ASEAN literacy or Indonesian literacy, which would be no surprise to you, Nick, as an Indonesian teacher. So it's not just the language skills, but just sort of the real understanding and appreciation of a big important country that's a neighbour of ours. I think that by investing in knowledge and appreciation for our neighbours before kind of setting forth, I think that can help to develop that sort of that longer run understanding and also trust with local players that will then support better investment outcomes. But look, there are barriers. Like, if you read something like a World Bank Doing Business report or whatever, there are some countries that it's easier to invest in than others, and some of them it's easier to resolve disputes when they come up, and some of them it's easier to repatriate earnings, and some have stricter rules around nationality of directors and this kind of thing. So there are things that the Australian government and Australian business interests can also start to try to address in our markets of interest. And we've got a host of trade agreements and bilateral sort of government-to-government connections by which both commercial players and also the federal government can continue to sort of push for better market access and connections and investment access. But yeah, I really wouldn't. You can't underline strongly enough this importance of committing and being there for the long haul. Not just turning up with a box of things to sell. They're long relationships, and trusted partners are going to be the key. So joint ventures, yes. As you say, there are risks in all business partnerships. But yeah, taking the market you're entering seriously and trying to think about mutual benefit as well as just return on investment.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, John. Any partnership with a Southeast Asian firm or even nation must revolve around this concept of mutual benefit. For these relationships to last and be sustainable, both sides need to benefit and see an outcome which is tangible for them. Additionally, this point about the long game, the profits to be made in Southeast Asia don't come overnight. Places like Indonesia, we're looking at 20, 30-year investments. Businesses need to understand that it's long term. Building on this idea of being there for the long term, your point on ASEAN literacy is extremely important. I think businesses and their leaders need to invest in learning the language and culture of a nation. This will allow them to succeed in navigating the business climate. Sadly, that brings us to the end of our podcast today. I want to thank John for his time. I really enjoyed discussing all things Southeast Asia with you.
No problem. Thanks, Nick. It was a pleasure.